Now there's another important concept called potential GDP. And why this is important is because it allows us to derive a concept called the output gap. And I'll tell you why that's important in a moment. But let's go back to our previous example where we were able to produce 6 apples and 4 oranges. And let's assume that all of the productive resources in our economy were being fully used to produce that output. So that's what we would call full employment output or potential output. It's as much as you can get out of an economy given its current available productive resources like land and machinery and labour. So now we've defined potential GDP, which is the maximum the economy can produce if all of the productive resources are fully employed. Let's see what happens in year 4. Now in year 4 we observe 4 apples being sold at $1 per unit, that's $4 of total sales, and 4 oranges are being sold at 50 cents each, which adds up to $2. So total GDP in year 4 is 4 plus 2 equals $6. Now then you say, well, we've now got a $2 shortfall. Potential was $8 when all the resources were fully employed, and now we've only produced $6 of GDP, and that's because apple production has fallen, and so we have an output gap of $2 or 25%. And what that means is that the current economic activity is 25% below its potential. Now that's simple enough to understand, but this concept has an ideological component to it because it's used to indicate how strong an intervention fiscal policy should make into the economy. What does that mean? If you have a large output gap, that means that there's insufficient spending to produce enough sales and output to fully employ all of the labour force and other productive inputs. And so the indication for government would be to increase its deficit and produce more sales and output demand. Whereas if you have a very small output gap, the scope for government intervention in terms of increasing spending is lower. And the ideological component is that the forces that want to reduce the involvement of the government in the economy have an incentive to always underestimate the size of the output gap. And the way they do that is to underestimate potential GDP. And they do that by having a higher unemployment rate associated with full employment than I would have. And so by having a higher unemployment rate, they reduce the size of potential GDP and therefore they reduce output gaps. So a person with an MMT understanding will typically have a much larger output gap at any given time because they know that the government can always produce higher employment levels.